In 1922, archaeologists working in the Indus Valley made a discovery that would haunt them for decades. They unearthed an ancient city, perfectly planned, sophisticated beyond imagination, called Mohenjo-daro. The name itself is chilling. Translated from Sindhi, it means mound of the dead. This wasn't just another archaeological site, wasn't just ruins to catalogue and study. This was a mystery that defied every explanation, a crime scene frozen in time for 5,000 years. The city showed no signs of gradual decline, no evidence of invasion or siege, no weapons of defense scattered about. Instead, it revealed something far more disturbing, something that mainstream archaeology has spent a century trying to explain away. The layout of Mohenjo-daro shocked the excavation team, impressed them in ways ancient cities rarely did. The streets were laid out in perfect grid patterns, geometrically precise, planned with mathematical sophistication. The buildings had advanced drainage systems, indoor plumbing, public baths with sophisticated water management. This was engineering that rivaled modern city planning, technology that shouldn't have existed 5,000 years ago in the conventional timeline of human development. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the architecture flawless, the urban design more advanced than anything Europe would achieve for another 3,000 years. This was clearly a thriving civilization at its peak, a society with knowledge and capabilities that historians struggle to account for. But something terrible had happened here, something catastrophic and sudden. As the archaeologists dug deeper, as they carefully brushed away layers of ancient soil, they found bodies. 44 human skeletons, scattered throughout the city, lying in streets and inside buildings. These weren't burial sites, weren't carefully arranged graves with funeral goods and ritual positioning. These were people who had died suddenly, instantly, caught in the middle of daily activities. Some were lying face down in the streets, others huddled in corners, several were holding hands as if seeking comfort in final moments. The position suggested panic, suggested people running, trying to escape something they couldn't outrun. What killed them remained a mystery, one that deepened with every test performed. There was no evidence of violence, no sword marks on bones, no arrows or spear points embedded in remains. There were no signs of disease, no skeletal deformities suggesting plague or epidemic. The bodies showed no trauma, no broken bones from building collapse or natural disaster. They simply died, all at once, across the entire city. Men, women, children, rich and poor, all struck down simultaneously by something that left no conventional trace. The archaeologists were baffled, unable to classify the cause of death, unable to fit it into any known category of ancient catastrophe. Then the radiation tests came back, and everything changed. In the 1990s, researchers using modern equipment measured radiation levels at the site, standard procedure for archaeological dating and environmental assessment. What they found was shocking, deeply troubling, impossible to reconcile with accepted history. The skeletons showed radiation levels 50 times higher than normal background radiation. This wasn't uniform across the site, wasn't consistent with natural uranium deposits in soil. The highest concentrations were at the center of the city, decreasing gradually toward the edges, creating a pattern that physicists recognized immediately. It was the signature of a blast epicenter, the radiation footprint left by nuclear detonation. The stones told an even stranger story, evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away easily. Throughout the city, particularly in the central areas, archaeologists found something unprecedented. The bricks and stones were vitrified, transformed into glass, fused together by temperatures that ancient technology couldn't possibly achieve. This wasn't localized melting, wasn't isolated patches that might suggest fires or kilns. This was a layer of glass, roughly 1.5 meters thick, covering large sections of the city. The buildings themselves had partially melted, their walls flowing like candle wax before solidifying again, preserving the moment of incredible heat in frozen ripples and waves. Scientists analyzed these vitrified materials, tested them in laboratories, measured the temperatures required to produce such effects. The results were consistent, troubling, and inexplicable. The stones had been heated to at least 1,400 to 1,500 degrees Celsius, sustained temperatures that turned solid rock into liquid glass. Ancient pottery kilns reached maybe 600 to 800 degrees at maximum, nowhere near sufficient for this level of vitrification. Large-scale fires, even burning for days, couldn't generate these temperatures. Natural forest fires peaked around 800 degrees, building fires slightly higher, but nothing in the ancient world could sustain 1,500 degrees across such a wide area. The comparisons to modern nuclear test sites became impossible to ignore, despite how uncomfortable they made historians. In 1945, when the United States detonated the first atomic bomb at Trinity Site in New Mexico, the sand beneath Ground Zero melted into green glass. Scientists called it trinitite, a new substance created by nuclear heat fusing silicon. The glass at Mohenjo-Daro looked identical, had the same properties, showed the same fusion patterns. Experts who examined both materials couldn't distinguish them chemically, couldn't find significant differences in structure or composition. The only distinction was age, one created in 1945, the other existing for 5,000 years. Every conventional explanation failed under scrutiny, collapsed when confronted with the actual evidence. Volcanic activity was suggested, but there are no volcanoes within 2,000 kilometers of Mohenjo-Daro, no geological evidence of eruptions in the region's history. Lightning strikes were proposed, but lightning creates small glass formations, not citywide vitrification layers. A single bolt might fuse a small area, but the affected zone at Mohenjo-Daro covered acres, far beyond what any electrical storm could produce. Meteor impact seemed plausible initially, but there's no crater, no impact fragments, no shock patterns in the surrounding geology. The destruction was intense but localized to the city itself, not radiating outward from a collision point. The mainstream archaeological community responded with silence, with dismissal, with carefully worded statements that avoided direct engagement. Official reports acknowledged the vitrified materials, admitted the unusual circumstances, but stopped short of drawing conclusions. The radiation measurements were questioned, the methodology criticized, the researchers accused of contamination or equipment errors. When that didn't work, when the evidence remained solid, the strategy shifted to ignoring it entirely. Textbooks about Mohenjo-Daro mention the advanced urban planning, the sophisticated drainage, the mysterious abandonment. They don't mention the glass, the radiation, or the bodies frozen in poses of terror. They certainly don't mention that the only known process that produces these exact effects is nuclear explosion. The implications are staggering, world-shattering, if you follow the evidence honestly. If Mohenjo-Daro was destroyed by nuclear weapons, then someone 5,000 years ago possessed technology we didn't rediscover until 1945. If that's true, then human history isn't the linear progression we've been taught, isn't a steady climb from primitive to advanced. It suggests civilizations rise and fall, that knowledge can be lost, that we might be rediscovering technologies our ancestors already mastered and then destroyed themselves with. The vitrified stones aren't just archaeological curiosities, aren't just unexplained anomalies. They're evidence of ancient nuclear war, proof that humanity has been to this technological precipice before, and the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro show us exactly what happened when we fell off the edge. The vitrified stones of Mohenjo-Daro represent physical evidence that shouldn't exist, material proof that challenges everything we think we know about ancient capabilities. When archaeologists first documented these glass-like formations in the 1920s and 1930s, they catalogued them carefully, photographed them, took samples for analysis. But they had no framework for understanding what they were seeing, no reference point in human history for comparison. These weren't decorative glass objects, weren't intentionally crafted materials. These were structural stones, building blocks and bricks that had been transformed by heat so intense it altered their molecular structure, fusing minerals together into new compounds. The layer of vitrified material wasn't thin, wasn't a surface effect that might suggest brief exposure to extreme heat. The glass extended deep into the stone, penetrating 1.5 meters in some locations, creating a crust that covered entire sections of the ancient city. This depth indicates sustained temperatures, prolonged exposure to heat that remained constant long enough to melt through solid rock. The distribution pattern was equally revealing, equally troubling when analyzed carefully. The vitrification was most intense at the city center, where buildings had completely melted into glassy slag. Moving outward from this epicenter, the effect diminished gradually, with less melting at the periphery, creating concentric zones of decreasing heat damage. Scientists who studied these materials brought expertise from multiple disciplines, metallurgy and geology and materials science. They subjected the samples to every test available, analyzing chemical composition, measuring crystalline structures, determining the precise temperatures required to produce observed effects. The consensus was unanimous, undisputed across different laboratories and different researchers. The temperatures had reached at least 1,400 degrees Celsius, possibly higher in the central zones, possibly approaching 1,600 or 1,700 degrees. These aren't theoretical estimates, aren't guesses based on visual appearance. These are calculations derived from the actual transformation of minerals, from knowing exactly how silicon dioxide behaves under heat, from understanding the melting points of various stone components. To put these temperatures in perspective, to understand how impossible they were for ancient civilizations, consider what humans could achieve with fire technology 5,000 years ago. The most advanced furnaces of the Bronze Age, the pinnacle of metallurgical achievement, reached perhaps 800 to 900 degrees Celsius. These furnaces required carefully designed bellows, controlled airflow, specific fuel mixtures, and constant attention from skilled operators. They could melt copper and tin, could create bronze alloys, but they couldn't come close to melting stone. Even iron smelting, which came later and represented a major technological leap, only required temperatures around 1,200 degrees. No ancient culture, anywhere on Earth, had furnaces that could sustain 1,500 degrees across large areas. The comparison to trinitite became unavoidable once nuclear testing began in the 1940s, once scientists had actual examples of what atomic weapons did to sand and stone. At the Trinity site in New Mexico, on July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb created temperatures estimated at several thousand degrees Celsius at ground zero. The desert sand, composed primarily of silicon dioxide, melted instantly and fused into a glassy green substance. Scientists collected samples, studied them extensively, and created a detailed profile of this new material. When researchers later compared trinitite to the vitrified stones from Mohenjo-Daro, the similarities were striking, undeniable, profoundly disturbing. Both materials showed the same type of mineral fusion, the same patterns of rapid melting and solidification. Both contained the same crystalline structures, formed when molten silicon dioxide cools quickly. Both had bubbles trapped in the glass, air pockets created when gases escaped from melting stone. Both showed evidence of temperatures far beyond what conventional fires or volcanic activity produces. The chemical signatures were nearly identical, the physical properties matched, the formation processes appeared to be the same. The only significant difference was the age, one freshly created in the atomic age, the other ancient beyond conventional historical frameworks. Independent laboratories confirmed these findings, verified the comparisons, and reached uncomfortable conclusions. Geologists who had studied volcanic glass, natural formations created by lava flows, noted clear differences between those materials and the Mohenjo-Daro samples. Volcanic glass forms gradually, as lava cools over hours or days, creating different crystalline patterns. The Mohenjo-Daro glass formed rapidly, instantly, showing the signature of sudden, explosive heat. Materials scientists who worked with industrial furnaces, who understood high-temperature processes intimately, stated flatly that no known ancient technology could produce these effects. Nuclear physicists who studied the Trinity site material saw the same formation mechanisms, the same heat profiles, the same rapid fusion signatures. The attempts to explain this evidence through conventional means grew increasingly desperate, increasingly implausible as each hypothesis collapsed under scrutiny. The lightning strike theory was proposed early, suggesting that massive electrical discharge could generate sufficient heat to vitrify stone. This works on paper, sounds reasonable at first hearing, but fails when examined in detail. Lightning strikes do create fulgurites, tubular glass formations where electricity fuses sand, but these are small, narrow, following the path of the electrical current through the ground. They're measured in centimeters or meters, not covering acres of cityscape. To vitrify Mohenjo-Daro through lightning would require thousands of simultaneous strikes, all concentrated in one area, all hitting with perfect timing. The statistical probability of this is effectively zero, and there's no mechanism that would cause such an impossible electrical storm. The massive fire theory suggested that the city burned for extended periods, that accumulated heat from sustained conflagration could reach temperatures high enough to melt stone. This theory appeals to common sense, to the observation that big fires get very hot. But physics doesn't support it, thermodynamics doesn't allow it. Wood fires, even burning at maximum intensity with perfect oxygen flow, peak around 800 to 900 degrees Celsius. Building fires, incorporating various combustible materials, might reach 1000 degrees briefly. But stone begins melting at 1400 degrees, and Mohenjo-Daro's vitrification required sustained exposure at this temperature. No organic fire, regardless of fuel or duration, can maintain these temperatures. The city would need to burn with heat sources that didn't exist in the ancient world. The volcanic activity explanation was grasping at straws, proposing mechanisms that geological surveys categorically rule out. The nearest volcanic activity to Mohenjo-Daro is over 2,000 kilometers away, across geological regions with completely different tectonic characteristics. There are no volcanic deposits in the area, no ash layers, no lava flows, no pyroclastic materials. The ground composition is alluvial, formed by river deposits over millennia, showing no signs of volcanic influence. Even if a volcano had existed nearby, which geology proves it didn't, the vitrification pattern is wrong. Volcanic heat radiates from the source, creating uniform damage across affected areas. Mohenjo-Daro's vitrification has an epicenter, a blast pattern, with decreasing intensity radiating outward. This is explosion damage, not volcanic flow. The meteor impact theory had initial plausibility, explaining sudden catastrophe and extreme heat through celestial collision. Large meteors do generate enormous temperatures on impact, can create glass from sand and rock, have caused mass extinctions throughout Earth's history. But meteor impacts leave unmistakable signatures, evidence that geologists can identify easily. There must be a crater, a depression where the object struck. There must be shocked quartz, minerals showing the unique pressure patterns of hypervelocity impact. There must be meteor fragments, exotic materials from space scattered around the site. Mohenjo-Daro has none of these, no crater within hundreds of kilometers, no shocked minerals, no extraterrestrial materials. The city was destroyed in place, not by something falling from the sky. Each failed explanation strengthened the nuclear hypothesis, made the uncomfortable conclusion harder to avoid. When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. The vitrified stones couldn't have been created by fire, lightning, volcanoes, or meteors. The evidence doesn't support any of these explanations, the physics doesn't work, the geological context is wrong. But the evidence perfectly matches nuclear detonation, matches it in every measurable way, matches it so precisely that distinguishing ancient vitrification from modern atomic test sites requires carbon dating rather than chemical analysis. The stones are telling us exactly what happened, speaking in the clear language of physics and material science. Mohenjo-Daro was destroyed by temperatures that only nuclear weapons produce, by heat that ancient civilizations supposedly couldn't generate, by technology that rewrites human history if we have the courage to accept what the evidence is saying. The physical evidence at Mohenjo-Daro is compelling, disturbing, but it exists in isolation without context or explanation. The stones tell us what happened, but they don't tell us who did it, why it was done, or how ancient peoples understood these events. For that context, for the human narrative behind the destruction, we must turn to the ancient texts of India, to scriptures written thousands of years ago that describe events eerily similar to what archaeology has uncovered. The Mahabharata, one of the longest epic poems in human history, contains passages that seem impossible, descriptions that shouldn't exist in texts predating modern science by millennia. The Mahabharata was composed approximately 5,000 years ago, transmitted orally for generations before being written down, preserving stories that may extend even further back in time. It describes great wars between kingdoms and dynasties, conflicts involving divine beings and supernatural weapons. For centuries, scholars dismissed these descriptions as mythology, as poetic exaggeration, as religious allegory not meant to be taken literally. The weapons described in the text, called astras, were understood as magical rather than technological, supernatural gifts from gods rather than actual devices. But when you read the descriptions carefully, when you compare them to modern weapons documentation, the parallels become impossible to ignore. The Brahastra is described as the ultimate weapon, the most destructive force in the ancient arsenal. The text states it was so powerful that it could only be used once, that its deployment would have catastrophic consequences, that warriors who possessed knowledge of this weapon were sworn to use it only in the most desperate circumstances. The description of its effects reads like an eyewitness account of nuclear detonation, so precise in its details that it seems inconceivable that someone could invent these descriptions without seeing the actual phenomenon. The text describes a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, a weapon that when unleashed created light brighter than 10,000 suns rising together in the sky. The mushroom cloud appears in the Mahabharata, described with accuracy that predates modern physics by thousands of years. The text states that when the Brahastra exploded, it created an incandescent column of smoke and flame as bright as 10,000 suns that rose in all its splendor. This pillar of fire then spread to form a billowing mushroom, expanding outward and upward, creating a characteristic shape that no ancient writer should have known about. The mushroom cloud is a specific phenomenon, caused by rapid expansion of superheated air creating a vortex that draws smoke and debris upward before spreading at altitude. This isn't something you can observe from normal fires or natural disasters. This is the signature of explosive nuclear fission, the unmistakable mark of atomic weapons. The radiation effects described in the Mahabharata match modern understanding of acute radiation syndrome with frightening precision. The text describes warriors who survived the initial blast but then suffered mysterious ailments, symptoms that appeared days after the weapon's deployment. Hair and nails fell out, the text states, describing the classic signs of radiation exposure. Food became poisoned, suggesting contamination of supplies by radioactive fallout. Warriors threw themselves in rivers to wash themselves and their equipment, attempting to decontaminate, instinctively understanding that something invisible was causing their suffering. These aren't generic descriptions of plague or disease, these are specific symptoms that only appear after exposure to high levels of radiation. The most chilling passage describes the weapon's effect on unborn children, on populations that weren't even present during the battle. The text states that all the races of men and animals were affected, that the destruction extended beyond the immediate combatants. It describes how the embryos in the womb were killed, how future generations were destroyed before birth, how entire bloodlines ended not just through immediate death but through sterilization and genetic damage. This understanding of radiation's effect on reproduction, on fetal development, on genetic material, shouldn't exist in ancient texts. Modern science only discovered these effects in the 1940s and 1950s through tragic experience with atomic bomb survivors and nuclear testing casualties. The Vimanas, flying machines described throughout ancient Indian texts, appear in the Mahabharata as weapons platforms, vehicles that delivered these devastating weapons from the sky. The descriptions are technical, detailed, including specifications for construction, operation, and combat maneuvers. These weren't gods riding on clouds or mythical creatures carrying warriors. The texts describe manufactured vehicles, built from specific materials, powered by mechanisms that the writers attempted to explain in terms they understood. The Vimanas could fly great distances, could hover over targets, could drop weapons with precision. The tactical descriptions match modern bomber operations, with scouts identifying targets, command centers authorizing strikes, and delivery vehicles executing attacks from altitude. The text includes warnings about using the Brahastra, cautions that seem to reflect actual experience with weapons of mass destruction. Warriors are told that using this weapon will poison the land for generations, that areas where it's deployed will become uninhabitable, that the effects will persist long after the battle ends. The text describes the moral burden of possessing such power, the terrible responsibility of knowing how to unleash destruction that can't be controlled or contained. These aren't abstract ethical discussions, these read like nuclear deterrence theory, like the Cold War doctrine of mutually assured destruction. The ancient writers understood that some weapons are too powerful to use, that possessing them changes warfare fundamentally, that their deployment risks destroying victors and vanquished alike. The activation procedures described in the text suggest technological rather than magical weapons, devices that required specific knowledge and precise operation. The Brahastra couldn't simply be thrown or fired like conventional weapons. It required mantras, specific verbal formulas that the texts preserve in detail. Modern interpreters assume these were magical incantations, religious spells that called upon divine power. But what if these were technical specifications, launch codes, activation sequences that had to be recited exactly to prevent accidental detonation? The texts emphasize that only specially trained warriors could use these weapons, that the knowledge was restricted, that improper use could result in the weapon destroying its own wielder. This is operation security, weapon safety protocols, not mythology. The Sanskrit terminology used to describe these weapons has puzzled linguists for centuries, words that don't have clear meanings in normal contexts. Terms like continuous shower of arrows, iron thunderbolt, fire weapon, wind weapon, appear throughout the text with specific technical distinctions. Scholars assumed these were poetic variations, different ways of saying very powerful weapon without literal meaning. But what if they're actual weapon types, different delivery systems or warhead configurations? The continuous shower sounds like cluster munitions, the iron thunderbolt like a kinetic energy weapon, the fire weapon like incendiaries or thermobaric explosives. The ancient writers were trying to categorize and distinguish between different weapon effects using vocabulary available to them. The skeptical response to these interpretations is predictable, expected, rooted in assumptions about technological development and human progress. Scholars argue that ancient peoples had vivid imaginations, that they created elaborate fantasies to explain natural phenomena or to glorify their ancestors. They suggest that descriptions of nuclear weapons are coincidental, that similar language could describe any powerful explosion or natural disaster. They point out that many mythologies contain exaggerated battle scenes, that gods throwing thunderbolts appears in Greek, Norse, and other traditions without implying actual nuclear weapons. These criticisms have surface validity, sound reasonable when stated quickly, but they collapse when examined against the specificity of the Indian texts. The Mahabharata doesn't just describe powerful explosions, doesn't just use vague language about divine wrath and cosmic fire. It describes specific sequential events, heat then shockwave then radiation, matching nuclear detonation chronology. It describes specific symptoms, hair loss then nausea then death, matching radiation syndrome progression. It describes specific long-term effects, poisoned land and genetic damage, matching fallout contamination. It describes specific countermeasures, washing and evacuation, matching actual survival strategies. This level of detail, this consistency with nuclear weapons effects, can't be explained as lucky guessing or poetic imagination. The writers were describing something real, something they had witnessed or learned about from reliable sources, something that matches modern nuclear weapons so precisely that dismissing it requires ignoring overwhelming textual evidence. The question of how ancient peoples could have imagined nuclear weapons without seeing them assumes that imagination works randomly, that people can invent detailed descriptions of phenomena they've never encountered. But imagination builds on experience, extrapolates from known things, creates variations on observed reality. Ancient peoples imagined gods as larger humans because they knew humans. They imagined dragons as combinations of known animals because they knew snakes and lizards and birds. They didn't imagine computers, didn't describe quantum physics, didn't invent concepts completely outside their experimental framework. Yet somehow, according to skeptics, they perfectly imagined nuclear weapons, described every aspect correctly, included technical details that wouldn't be discovered until the 20th century, all through pure creative fiction. The probability of this is vanishingly small, essentially zero when examined honestly. The simpler explanation, the one that requires fewer assumptions, is that they described nuclear weapons because nuclear weapons existed, because ancient civilizations possessed technology we've barely rediscovered, because the Mahabharata preserves actual history of ancient nuclear war that destroyed civilizations like Mohenjo-Daro and changed human history forever. The Mahabharata isn't alone, isn't an isolated text describing impossible weapons and catastrophic warfare. Ancient Indian literature contains multiple sources, different texts from different periods, all describing similar phenomena with consistent details. The Ramayana, considered even older than the Mahabharata by some scholars, dates back approximately 7,000 years in its oral traditions. It describes wars between kingdoms separated by vast distances, conflicts that involved weapons matching nuclear descriptions. The consistency across these independent sources, written or preserved by different authors in different eras, suggests they're drawing from common historical events rather than inventing similar fantasies separately. The Ramayana describes the Agnya weapon, translated as fire missile or weapon of fire, deployed in battles that devastated entire armies. The text states this weapon created smokeless fire, a description that puzzled translators for centuries because all fire produces smoke from burning fuel. But nuclear explosions do create flames without smoke initially. The fireball from atomic detonation burns so hot that complete combustion occurs, creating light and heat without the incomplete burning that produces visible smoke. The Ramayana's description is technically accurate, preserving details that only make sense when understood as nuclear rather than conventional fire. The Drona Parva, one of the books within the Mahabharata, contains perhaps the most detailed description of ancient nuclear weapons effects. It describes a weapon that created an incandescent column of smoke and flame, matching the mushroom cloud imagery from other texts. But it goes further, providing sequential description of the weapon's effects over time. First comes blinding light, as if the heavens had split open, matching the initial flash of nuclear detonation visible hundreds of miles away. Then comes the heat wave, furnace-like, that burns everything near the epicenter. Then comes the shock wave, a terrible wind that levels buildings and throws warriors through the air. Finally comes the aftermath, the lingering effects that kill survivors slowly through mysterious illness. The Mausala Parva describes the complete destruction of the city of Dwaraka, an event so catastrophic that it ended an entire civilization. The text states that a blazing shaft, possessed of the effulgence of smokeless fire, was seen. This shaft, this beam or bolt, fell upon the city and created immediate devastation. The city with its streets and mansions and walls fell down, opening wide like a split-open bamboo. The description suggests structural collapse from overpressure, buildings imploding from shockwave effects. Then comes the flood, water rushing in to cover the ruins, matching tsunami effects from coastal nuclear detonation or the subsidence of land devastated by explosive force. The Bhagavad Gita, the philosophical core of the Mahabharata, contains a passage where the god Krishna reveals his true cosmic form to the warrior Arjuna. The description uses language that later nuclear physicists found eerily familiar. Robert Oppenheimer, director of the Manhattan Project, famously quoted this passage after witnessing the first atomic bomb test. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," he said, reciting the Bhagavad Gita from memory. Oppenheimer studied Sanskrit, read the ancient texts, and recognized in them descriptions that matched what he had just created. He saw the connection between ancient weapons and modern ones, understood that the texts were describing something real. The Puranas, ancient Hindu texts that chronicle cosmic history and genealogies of gods and kings, contain references to weapons that reduced entire cities to ash in moments. The Vishnu Purana describes a weapon that burned without leaving residue, that turned strong men to cinders, that poisoned the water and the land. The Shiva Purana mentions thunder that shook the foundations of the world, explosions that rent the sky itself, catastrophes that ended ages and began new ones. These aren't isolated passages in obscure sections. These themes run throughout the texts, creating a consistent narrative of advanced weapons and terrible wars. The geographical references in these texts provide another layer of evidence, locations that can be mapped to actual sites showing signs of ancient catastrophe. The Mahabharata describes battles at Kurukshetra, a region in modern Haryana, India. Archaeological surveys of this area have found unusual concentrations of vitrified materials, stones melted and fused at temperatures conventional ancient warfare couldn't produce. The texts describe the Thar desert region as once fertile and populated, destroyed by weapons that had turned green lands to wasteland. The Thar desert does show signs of rapid desertification, geological changes that occurred far faster than normal climate shifts would explain. The timeline presented in these texts aligns with the archaeological evidence from Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus Valley sites. The Mahabharata describes the Dwapara Yuga, an age that ended approximately 5,000 years ago with catastrophic warfare. This matches the dating of Mohenjo-Daro's destruction, the sudden abandonment of Harappan cities, the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization. The texts describe this transition as the end of a golden age, a time when knowledge and power were greater than in subsequent eras. This matches the archaeological pattern of sudden civilizational regression, advanced urban planning replaced by simple villages, sophisticated technology lost and not recovered for thousands of years. The Tamil texts from southern India, independent of the Sanskrit traditions of the north, contain similar references to ancient advanced weapons. The Silapathikaram, dated to around 2,000 years ago but preserving older oral traditions, describes the destruction of cities by fire from the sky. The Manimekalai speaks of weapons that burned without fuel, that killed at great distances, that left the land cursed for generations. These southern texts couldn't have borrowed from northern sources due to linguistic and cultural separation, yet they describe the same types of weapons and catastrophes. Buddhist texts, which emerged from Indian traditions but developed their own distinct literature, also contain references to advanced ancient weapons. The Tripitaka, the Buddhist canon, includes passages describing the Buddha encountering weapons of tremendous power during his travels. The texts indicate he advised kings to abandon these weapons, warning that their use would lead to mutual destruction. The Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's previous incarnations, include accounts of kingdoms destroyed by celestial weapons, by fires that consumed everything, by explosions that shook the earth. The consistency across different religious and cultural traditions within India suggests these descriptions preserve actual historical memory, not religious invention. Hindu texts, Buddhist texts, Jain texts, all describe similar weapons and catastrophes. They use different terminology, emphasize different aspects, tell stories from different perspectives, but the core descriptions match. It's similar to how different cultures describe the same historical event, each adding cultural interpretation but preserving factual details. The weapons were real, the wars happened, the catastrophes occurred, and different traditions preserved the memory in ways that made sense within their belief systems. The technical vocabulary used across these texts shows evidence of specialized knowledge, terminology that suggests actual weapon systems rather than mythological inventions. The texts distinguish between different types of astras based on their effects. The Agni Astra produces fire and heat. The Vayu Astra creates powerful winds and shock waves. The Vayuna Astra involves water, possibly describing steam explosions or hydrogen weapons. The Narayana Astra releases millions of deadly missiles, sounding like cluster munitions or MIRV warheads. These aren't random variations on very powerful weapon. These are systematic classifications of different weapon types based on distinct operational characteristics. The texts also describe countermeasures, defensive techniques against these weapons, suggesting real tactical knowledge rather than fantasy. Certain astras could only be countered by specific defensive astras, creating a weapons versus defenses dynamic that mirrors modern military doctrine. The texts describe water as a defense against fire weapons, retreat as protection from shockwave weapons, mantras as activation codes that could disarm weapons if recited correctly. Some of these make tactical sense, others might be corrupted preservation of technical procedures no longer understood, but the overall pattern suggests real weapon systems with real operational constraints. The transmission of this knowledge through oral tradition for thousands of years before being written raises questions about accuracy and reliability. Skeptics point out that oral transmission introduces errors, that stories grow and change over generations, that what survives might bear little resemblance to original events. This is valid concern. Oral transmission does alter content over time. But extensive research into oral traditions, particularly in cultures that valued precise memorization, shows they can preserve remarkable accuracy. The Mahabharata was memorized by Brahmin priests who trained for years to recite it perfectly, who checked each other's recitations, who valued exact preservation. The consistency across different lineages of transmission, different regional versions, suggests the core descriptions remain stable despite oral transmission. The question remains why these texts would preserve technical knowledge about weapons their societies couldn't reproduce, information that had no practical value if the technology was lost. One explanation is that these texts served as warnings, cautionary tales about the dangers of advanced weapons, preserved specifically to prevent future generations from repeating past mistakes. The texts repeatedly emphasize the moral problems of using astras, the terrible responsibility of possessing such power, the catastrophic consequences when they are deployed. This reads like nuclear deterrence philosophy, like Cold War warnings about mutual assured destruction, like modern concerns about nuclear proliferation. The ancients were telling future generations that humanity had possessed weapons capable of destroying civilization, that we had used them and nearly wiped ourselves out, that we must never go down that path again. The ancient texts provided literary evidence, compelling descriptions that matched nuclear weapons' effects with disturbing accuracy. The vitrified stones provided physical evidence, materials transformed by temperatures that conventional technology couldn't achieve. But the most direct, most undeniable evidence of ancient nuclear catastrophe comes from the bodies themselves, from the skeletons found at Mohenjo-Daro that shouldn't be radioactive but are. In the early 1990s, a team of researchers brought modern radiation detection equipment to the site, standard procedure for archaeological dating and environmental assessment. What they discovered would shake the foundations of accepted history, provide forensic proof that something terrible and nuclear had happened here thousands of years ago. The radiation measurements began as routine work, background checks to establish baseline levels for the site. Archaeologists expected normal readings, the standard low-level radiation found everywhere on Earth from cosmic rays, radon gas, and trace radioactive elements in soil. Initial readings from the surrounding areas confirmed this, showing radiation levels consistent with other archaeological sites in the region. But when the detectors approached the city center, when they began measuring the skeletons themselves, the numbers spiked dramatically. The equipment registered radiation levels 50 times higher than normal background, concentrations that couldn't be explained by natural processes or environmental contamination. The distribution pattern of the radiation was revealing, creating a map that nuclear weapons experts would recognize immediately. The highest concentrations appeared at the city center, exactly where the vitrification was most intense, precisely where the most bodies were found. Moving outward from this epicenter, radiation levels decreased gradually, creating concentric zones of diminishing contamination. This wasn't random distribution, wasn't uniform environmental radiation that would show consistent levels across the site. This was blast pattern radiation, the signature left by detonation of a nuclear device with a definite center point and radiating effects. The physics matched perfectly with what nuclear weapons produce, what atomic testing creates at ground zero sites. The isotope analysis provided even more specific evidence, chemical fingerprints that distinguished this radiation from natural sources. Background radiation comes primarily from uranium and thorium in rocks, from potassium-40 in soil, from radon gas seeping up from deep deposits. These sources create predictable isotope ratios, signatures that geologists can identify easily. The radiation at Mohenjo-Daro showed different ratios, different isotope profiles, patterns that matched artificial nuclear reactions rather than natural radioactive decay. The specific isotopes detected were consistent with uranium or plutonium fission, the same reactions that power nuclear weapons, not the gradual decay of natural radioactive materials. The bones themselves told a story of acute radiation exposure, effects that only appear when living tissue encounters high-energy particles from nuclear reactions. Modern forensic techniques can detect radiation damage in bones, changes to the crystalline structure of calcium phosphate, alterations that persist for thousands of years. The Mohenjo-Daro skeletons showed these changes, particularly in the bones from the city center, in the individuals who died in the streets. The damage patterns matched what nuclear medicine sees in radiation therapy patients, what Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors showed in their bones, what atomic testing workers developed after exposure to nuclear materials. The research team published preliminary findings in 1992, submitting papers to archaeological journals describing the anomalous radiation levels. The response was immediate, hostile, and telling. Established archaeologists attacked the methodology, questioned the equipment calibration, suggested environmental contamination from modern sources. The idea that ancient sites could show nuclear radiation was too threatening to accepted timelines, too revolutionary to consider seriously. The papers were rejected from major journals, criticized in peer review as promoting pseudoscience, dismissed without serious examination of the evidence. The researchers found themselves marginalized, unable to secure funding for follow-up studies, effectively silenced by institutional pressure. In 1998, the situation changed from academic rejection to active suppression. The Indian government, responding to pressure from archaeological institutions and religious organizations, declared Mohenjo-Daro a restricted research site. New regulations limited access, required extensive permits for scientific studies, and specifically banned radiation testing without explicit government approval. This approval was rarely granted, applications disappeared into bureaucratic labyrinths, and researchers who persisted found their permits revoked and their credentials questioned. The official explanation mentioned preservation concerns, protecting the site from potential damage by invasive testing. But the timing was suspicious, occurring precisely when radiation evidence was becoming public, when international attention was focusing on these anomalous findings. The samples that had been collected, bone fragments and soil specimens showing elevated radiation, began disappearing from museums and research facilities. Institutions that had housed these materials reported them as misplaced, lost during renovations, or accidentally destroyed. Museums updated their catalogues, and items that had been photographed and documented simply vanished from records. Researchers who tried to follow up, who wanted to verify findings or conduct additional tests, were told the samples no longer existed. The few remaining specimens were reclassified as unavailable for testing, locked in storage with restricted access, effectively removed from scientific investigation. Scientists who had measured the radiation, who had published preliminary data, faced professional consequences that served as warnings to others. Some lost university positions, their contracts not renewed despite years of successful work. Others found funding dry up, grant applications rejected without explanation, research proposals dismissed as unsuitable. A few faced direct pressure, visits from government officials suggesting they focus their research elsewhere, implications that continuing this work would damage their careers. The message was clear, unambiguous, designed to silence investigation into Mohenjo-Daro's radiation. Whatever had happened there, whatever the truth about ancient nuclear catastrophe, powerful interests wanted it buried along with the radioactive bones. The official explanation for the radiation, when authorities acknowledged it at all, blamed natural environmental sources. They suggested radon gas seeping from underground, claimed uranium deposits in bedrock could create localized high readings, proposed that cosmic ray exposure over millennia might concentrate in certain materials. These explanations sound plausible to non-specialists, use scientific terminology that seems authoritative, but they don't withstand scrutiny. Radon creates widespread low-level radiation, not concentrated hotspots at city centers. Uranium deposits show up in geological surveys, and no such deposits exist near Mohenjo-Daro. Cosmic rays affect everything equally, don't create the precise blast pattern distribution found at the site. Independent researchers, working outside official channels, attempted to replicate the radiation measurements using smuggled equipment and covert site access. Several teams reported similar findings: elevated radiation at the city center, isotope profiles inconsistent with natural sources, patterns matching nuclear detonation effects. They published results online, in alternative journals, in venues beyond institutional control. Mainstream archaeology ignored these reports, refused to acknowledge their existence, maintained that no credible evidence supported nuclear catastrophe theories. But the evidence kept accumulating, multiple independent measurements confirming the original findings, creating a body of data that became impossible to dismiss through simple denial. The comparison to modern nuclear disaster sites became unavoidable once researchers had sufficient data. The radiation levels at Mohenjo-Daro's epicenter, approximately 50 times background, matched readings from Chernobyl's outer contamination zones. The isotope ratios resembled those found at nuclear weapons test sites decades after detonation, after short-lived isotopes had decayed but longer-lived contaminants persisted. The distribution pattern, strongest at center and decreasing with distance, mirrored Hiroshima and Nagasaki radiation maps. Every measurable characteristic matched nuclear contamination, none matched natural radioactive sources, creating overwhelming cumulative evidence that something nuclear had occurred. The question of how radiation could persist for 5,000 years confused many observers, seemed to contradict basic nuclear physics. Radioactive isotopes decay over time, their half-lives are well known, and most products of nuclear fission have relatively short half-lives of days, months, or years. How could radiation from an ancient event still be detectable millennia later? The answer lies in understanding which isotopes persist, which byproducts of nuclear reactions have half-lives measured in thousands or millions of years. Plutonium-239 has a half-life of 24,000 years, still strongly radioactive after 5,000 years. Uranium-235 has a half-life of 700 million years, essentially unchanged over human timescales. Nuclear detonation creates these long-lived isotopes, spreads them across blast zones, leaves contamination that persists for geological epochs. The forensic implications are staggering if we accept the evidence honestly. The radioactive skeletons at Mohenjo-Daro are murder victims, casualties of nuclear warfare, physical proof that ancient civilizations possessed and deployed weapons of mass destruction. Their bones preserve the crime scene, document the method of death, provide evidence that conventional history can't explain. They died suddenly, all at once, from exposure to radiation that could only come from nuclear weapons. No natural process, no environmental contamination, no cosmic accident could produce these effects. The bodies are telling us exactly what killed them, speaking in the clear language of nuclear physics, testifying from beyond death that humanity has been down this path before, that we've used atomic weapons before, that the ancient texts describing nuclear war weren't mythology but accurate history preserved across millennia. Mohenjo-Daro captures attention because of its dramatic evidence, its preserved destruction frozen in time like ancient Pompeii. But it's not unique, not an isolated anomaly that can be dismissed as unusual local phenomenon. Across the globe, scattered through regions thousands of miles apart, researchers have found other sites showing similar characteristics, the same combination of vitrification and radiation that defies conventional explanation. These sites create a pattern, suggest that whatever happened at Mohenjo-Daro was part of something larger, part of ancient conflicts that spanned continents and destroyed multiple civilizations simultaneously. Rajasthan, India, approximately 500 kilometers west of Mohenjo-Daro, contains a site that local authorities have tried to keep quiet for decades. In the Thar Desert region, near the border with Pakistan, there's an area roughly 5 square kilometers covered in a thick layer of radioactive ash. The ash isn't from volcanic activity, chemical analysis rules that out conclusively. It's not from forest fires or industrial contamination. The composition is wrong for organic burning. It's fine particulate matter, the kind created when materials are vaporized by extreme heat and then settle as fallout. Radiation levels throughout this zone exceed safe limits, creating health hazards for anyone spending extended time there. The Indian government declared this area off-limits in the 1970s, citing environmental concerns and archaeological preservation. But local residents tell different stories, accounts passed down through generations about the poisoned land where nothing grows. Villages near this zone report elevated cancer rates, birth defects appearing far more frequently than national averages, mysterious illnesses that doctors can't explain. These are the hallmarks of radiation exposure, effects seen in populations living near nuclear test sites or reactor accidents. Government health officials attribute these problems to poor sanitation or genetic factors, explanations that avoid addressing the radioactive ash covering the region. Construction projects that attempted to develop near this area encountered disturbing problems. Workers reported mysterious illnesses, burns that appeared without fire exposure, nausea and weakness that intensified the longer they remained on site. Radiation badges worn by some workers, standard safety equipment on construction sites, showed exposure levels that required immediate evacuation. The projects were quietly abandoned, the land declared unsuitable for development, and official records were sealed or destroyed. Journalists who investigated were discouraged, told there was nothing newsworthy, that raising concerns would cause unnecessary public panic. Scotland presents evidence thousands of miles from India, eliminating any possibility of shared local environmental factors. Ancient stone fortifications called vitrified forts dot the Scottish landscape, prehistoric structures whose walls were melted and fused together at temperatures conventional archaeology cannot explain. Over 60 of these forts exist, scattered across Scotland and extending into parts of England and Ireland. The stones comprising their walls were heated to at least 1,100 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt granite, hot enough to fuse separate blocks into single solid masses. The official explanation suggests that defenders set fire to wooden frameworks within the walls, creating sustained heat that vitrified the stone. This theory requires accepting that Iron Age peoples deliberately destroyed their own fortifications by burning them, that they somehow achieved temperatures far exceeding what wood fires can produce, that they did this repeatedly at dozens of different locations. The physics doesn't support it, the tactical logic makes no sense, and experimental archaeology attempting to replicate the process has failed consistently. Researchers built replica walls, burned them with every fuel source available to ancient peoples, and couldn't achieve the temperatures or fusion patterns found at actual vitrified forts. Alternative theories suggest these forts were attacked with weapons that generated extreme heat, that the vitrification was incidental damage from assault rather than intentional construction technique. The blast patterns at some sites support this, showing directional heating that matches incoming projectiles or explosions rather than internal burning. Radiation surveys conducted covertly at several vitrified forts detected elevated levels above background, not as high as Mohenjo-Daro but significant enough to suggest nuclear involvement. Scottish authorities haven't publicized these findings, haven't allowed systematic radiation testing, haven't acknowledged that their ancient sites might preserve evidence of nuclear warfare. The Libyan desert glass presents one of the most controversial pieces of evidence, a vast field of yellow-green glass scattered across 6,500 square kilometers of the Sahara. This glass is pure silica, almost no impurities, formed at temperatures exceeding 1,700 degrees Celsius. It dates to approximately 26 million years ago according to standard dating methods, but some researchers question this dating, suggesting contamination or reinterpretation might place it much more recently. The glass is identical in composition and formation to trinitite, the material created at atomic test sites, showing the same rapid melting and cooling patterns. Meteor impact was the initial explanation, the accepted theory taught in geology courses worldwide. Scientists proposed that a comet or asteroid exploded in the atmosphere above the desert, creating an airburst that generated sufficient heat to melt the sand below. This theory faces problems, primarily the complete absence of any impact crater or meteor fragments in the region. Airbursts that create extensive glass fields leave evidence, scattered meteor materials even if the main body vaporized. The Libyan desert has been surveyed extensively, geologists have mapped every square kilometer, and no meteor evidence exists. The glass is there, covering an area the size of a small country, without any conventional explanation for its creation. Radiation testing of Libyan desert glass shows elevated levels, not dramatically high but above normal background. The isotope ratios are controversial, some analyses suggesting natural sources while others indicate artificial nuclear reactions. The disagreement stems from testing methodology, from questions about contamination, from the challenge of analyzing ancient radioactive materials. What's undisputed is that the glass formation required temperatures and conditions that don't occur naturally except through meteor impact or nuclear detonation. Without meteor evidence, the nuclear hypothesis becomes stronger by elimination, the only remaining explanation that fits the physical evidence. Ancient Iraq, the region once called Mesopotamia and considered the cradle of civilization, contains vitrified materials at several archaeological sites. Babylon, the great ancient city, has sections of walls showing extreme heat damage, stones melted and fused in ways that suggest something more intense than normal fires. Ur, one of the oldest cities in human history, has similar vitrification in certain areas, concentrated damage that doesn't match the gradual destruction of siege warfare or accidental fire. These sites aren't as dramatic as Mohenjo-Daro, haven't been studied as intensively, but they show the same signature of extreme heat exposure. Iraq's political instability has prevented systematic radiation testing at these sites, decades of war and conflict making scientific research nearly impossible. What limited testing occurred during the 1980s, before the Gulf War, reportedly showed elevated radiation at some ancient sites. The data was never published, lost or destroyed during subsequent conflicts, leaving only anecdotal accounts from researchers who claimed to have seen the results. The region's modern contamination from depleted uranium munitions used in recent wars makes it nearly impossible now to distinguish ancient radiation from contemporary military sources, effectively destroying any remaining evidence. Egypt presents intriguing anomalies in its ancient structures, features that conventional Egyptology struggles to explain. The Temple of Atha at Dendera contains stone surfaces showing signs of intense heat damage, walls with vitrification patterns on interior sections where no fires should have occurred. The damage appears to come from inside the chambers, not from external burning, suggesting something within generated extreme temperatures. Official explanations mention ritual fires or lighting techniques, but these can't account for stone melting, can't explain the specific patterns of heat distribution. The global distribution of these sites reveals a pattern that becomes visible when plotted on maps showing ancient civilizations. The vitrification and radiation anomalies cluster around regions that ancient texts describe as centers of advanced civilization, areas that supposedly possessed powerful weapons or advanced technology. India, the Middle East, parts of Europe, all regions where ancient texts describe terrible wars and catastrophic weapons. The geographical evidence matches the textual evidence, creating corroboration between independent data sources, strengthening the hypothesis that ancient nuclear warfare wasn't limited to one location but affected multiple regions simultaneously. The timeline correlation is equally striking when examined across sites. The vitrification events, where datable through archaeological context, cluster around 4,000 to 10,000 years ago, the period when advanced ancient civilizations flourished and then suddenly collapsed. The Indus Valley Civilization ended abruptly around 1900 BCE. Mesopotamian cities show evidence of catastrophic destruction in similar time frames. Egyptian Old Kingdom collapsed mysteriously. These aren't gradual declines, aren't slow falls that conventional history attributes to climate change or invasion. These are sudden endings, civilizations at their peak vanishing within generations, leaving ruins that show signs of extreme violence. The skeptical response to this global evidence follows predictable patterns, dismissing each site individually while ignoring the cumulative weight of multiple locations showing similar characteristics. Scottish vitrified forts are explained as construction technique, despite physics proving this impossible. Libyan desert glass is attributed to meteor impact, despite complete absence of impact evidence. Mohenjo-Daro's radiation is blamed on natural environmental factors, despite isotope analysis proving otherwise. Each explanation might seem plausible in isolation, might satisfy casual inquiry, but examining them together reveals the pattern. Multiple sites, different continents, same effects, same time frame, same inability of conventional theories to explain the evidence. The simplest explanation, the one requiring fewest assumptions, is that ancient nuclear warfare occurred globally, that multiple civilizations possessed these weapons, that humanity fought atomic wars thousands of years ago and nearly destroyed itself in the process. The Harappan civilization stands as one of history's greatest mysteries, a society that achieved technological sophistication rivaling and in some ways exceeding ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. Spanning approximately 2 million square kilometers across modern Pakistan and northwestern India, it was the largest of the ancient world's civilizations, supporting an estimated 5 million people at its peak. The cities were marvels of urban planning, with standardized brick dimensions, sophisticated drainage systems, public baths with advanced hydraulics, and residential areas organized in geometric grids. This wasn't primitive settlement, this was advanced civilization operating at a level that Europe wouldn't achieve until the Roman Empire, and in some aspects, until the modern industrial age. The sophistication of Harappan infrastructure deserves emphasis because it establishes what was lost when this civilization vanished. Every house in Mohenjo-Daro had private wells, indoor bathrooms, and connections to covered drainage systems that channeled waste away from residential areas. The sewers were constructed with inspection ports for maintenance, showing understanding of sanitation engineering principles. The Great Bath, a public structure at the city center, featured waterproof brick construction using bitumen mortar, precise geometric measurements, and water circulation systems that kept the pool clean. This represents hydraulic engineering knowledge that most medieval cities lacked, technology that required mathematical sophistication and practical experience. The metallurgical capabilities of the Harappans demonstrated advanced understanding of materials science. Archaeological excavations have recovered copper tools and weapons showing high purity, indicating efficient smelting techniques. Bronze artifacts display precise alloy ratios, suggesting controlled mixing procedures rather than random experimentation. Some items show evidence of lost wax casting, a complex technique requiring multiple steps and careful temperature control. Iron objects, though rare, appear in contexts suggesting early ironworking knowledge, possibly predating the Iron Age chronology established by conventional archaeology. This wasn't primitive metalworking, this was systematic materials engineering approaching industrial levels of sophistication. The urban planning extended beyond individual cities to regional coordination. Harappan settlements spread across vast distances maintained remarkably consistent standards, same brick ratios, same building techniques, same weights and measures. This implies centralized authority with ability to enforce standards across hundreds of kilometers, communication networks that transmitted technical specifications accurately, and shared educational systems training builders to identical methods. Modern archaeologists struggle to explain how Bronze Age civilization achieved this level of standardization without technologies we associate with such coordination, without telecommunications, without mass media, without rapid transportation. Then, around 1900 BCE, it all disappeared. Within perhaps 2 or 3 generations, the Harappan civilization collapsed completely and utterly. The cities were abandoned, left to decay without evidence of gradual population decline. The sophisticated technologies vanished, replaced by simple village life showing none of the advanced capabilities. The writing system was lost entirely, undecipherable today because the knowledge died with no transmission to successor cultures. This is extinction, not decline, elimination rather than transformation. Civilizations don't usually disappear this way, don't lose all their accumulated knowledge simultaneously, don't abandon thriving cities without trace of where the populations went. The conventional explanation cites environmental factors, primarily climate change and river system alterations. Geological evidence shows the Sarasvati River, major waterway supporting Harappan settlements, dried up around this period as tectonic shifts diverted its sources. Paleoclimate data suggests droughts, extended dry periods that would stress agricultural societies. These factors undoubtedly contributed. Environmental stress certainly affected Harappan civilization. But environmental problems typically cause migration, populations moving to better locations while maintaining cultural continuity. Drought doesn't eliminate technology, doesn't erase knowledge of urban planning or metallurgy, doesn't explain why survivors didn't rebuild elsewhere or pass skills to subsequent generations. The abandonment pattern is wrong for climate-induced collapse. Climate change happens gradually over decades or centuries, giving populations time to adapt, migrate, or modify practices. Harappan cities show rapid abandonment, sudden cessation of construction and maintenance activities, quick transition from functioning urban center to empty ruins. Mohenjo-Daro wasn't gradually emptied over generations. It was abandoned quickly enough that bodies remained in streets, valuables were left in houses, no organized departure occurred. This suggests catastrophe rather than decline, event rather than process, something sudden enough that evacuation was panicked rather than planned. The complete loss of Harappan knowledge is the most damning evidence against gradual decline theories. When civilizations collapse slowly, even when cities are abandoned, knowledge survives through refugees, through cultural transmission to neighboring peoples, through gradual integration into successor societies. The Harappans had writing, extensive trade networks, contact with Mesopotamia and other civilizations. Yet their writing system wasn't adopted anywhere, their architectural techniques weren't copied, their metallurgical knowledge disappeared completely. It's as if an entire civilization's accumulated wisdom was erased, like burning a library that contained the only copies of books nobody had memorized. The pattern resembles Pompeii more than Rome's fall, instant destruction rather than gradual decay. Pompeii was buried by volcanic eruption, preserved at a moment in time, its inhabitants killed instantly with no warning. The city remained frozen, a snapshot of daily life interrupted catastrophically. Mohenjo-Daro shows similar characteristics, normal activities interrupted permanently, bodies in streets suggesting sudden death, absence of organized abandonment procedures. The comparison suggests volcanic-scale catastrophe, event measured in hours or days rather than years or decades. But there's no volcano, no ash layer, no conventional natural disaster that fits the evidence. Nuclear catastrophe fits the pattern perfectly, explains what conventional theories cannot. Atomic weapons produce instant devastation, destroying cities in moments, killing populations before they can flee. The heat and blast from nuclear detonation eliminate infrastructure immediately, the radiation lingers to poison survivors and make areas uninhabitable. Knowledge dies when the educated classes are eliminated simultaneously, when libraries and schools are incinerated, when craft specialists and their apprentices perish together. Neighboring civilizations wouldn't adopt technologies from radioactive ruins, wouldn't salvage techniques from contaminated cities, would avoid regions showing the mysterious sickness that radiation causes. The lack of successor civilization in the Indus Valley becomes explicable through radiation contamination. Normally, when cities are abandoned, new settlers eventually move in, attracted by existing infrastructure, available building materials, or strategic location. The Indus Valley cities remained abandoned for centuries, shunned by populations that should have recognized their value. Local oral traditions speak of these areas as cursed, as forbidden zones where death awaits those who settle. This makes no sense. If abandonment was from drought or river changes, why would myths warn against resettlement? But it makes perfect sense if radiation poisoning killed anyone who tried to inhabit the ruins, creating genuine danger that transformed into cultural taboo. The population question haunts conventional explanations. 5 million people don't vanish without trace. If Harappan civilization declined gradually, where did the populations go? Neighboring regions show no evidence of mass immigration, no sudden population increases that would indicate Harappan refugees. Genetic studies of modern populations show Harappan ancestry diffused across India, suggesting integration rather than migration, gradual mixing rather than displacement. But this mixing should have preserved Harappan culture, at least elements of their advanced technologies. Instead, successor cultures showed regression, simpler technologies, less sophisticated urban organization. It's as if the knowledge couldn't be transmitted, as if something prevented normal cultural continuity. Mass casualties from nuclear warfare explain the population disappearance without requiring trace in neighboring regions. If millions died in atomic attacks or subsequent radiation poisoning, their bodies would decompose, leaving minimal archaeological evidence. The 44 skeletons at Mohenjo-Daro might represent a tiny fraction of victims, most buried under collapsed buildings or scattered in outlying areas never excavated. Modern nuclear warfare scenarios predict 90 casualties in targeted cities, populations eliminated without chance to flee or record what happened. Ancient nuclear war would produce similar effects, genocidal destruction leaving few survivors to transmit culture or resettle devastated regions. The technological regression following Harappan collapse is unprecedented in archaeological records. Successor cultures in the region showed dramatic simplification, abandoning urban planning, reverting to simple village life, losing writing entirely. This isn't normal cultural evolution, isn't the pattern seen when civilizations decline from internal factors or external conquest. Even Dark Age Europe, following Rome's collapse, retained considerable knowledge, maintained some urban centers, preserved literacy through monasteries. The post-Harappan period shows more complete knowledge loss, suggesting the catastrophe eliminated not just cities but the educated classes who maintained specialized knowledge. The Vedic civilization that emerged in India after Harappan collapse preserved memories of advanced ancient warfare, codified them in texts like the Mahabharata and Ramayana. These texts describe the wars and weapons that destroyed earlier civilizations, warning future generations about dangers of advanced technology. The Vedic peoples didn't build cities matching Harappan's sophistication, didn't recover the lost technologies, but they preserved the history. They maintained oral traditions about what happened, about why the great cities lay in ruins, about weapons that could destroy the world. They were survivors telling cautionary tales, descendants of catastrophe trying to prevent repetition, witnesses to humanity's near extinction recording testimony for posterity. The mainstream archaeological establishment has developed an arsenal of explanations for Mohenjo-Daro's anomalies, theories designed to contain the evidence within acceptable frameworks without challenging fundamental assumptions about human technological development. These explanations sound reasonable on surface examination, employ scientific terminology, and satisfy those who prefer comfortable consensus over disturbing evidence. But when scrutinized carefully, when tested against the actual physical data, each explanation reveals fatal flaws that expose them as rationalizations rather than solutions, comfortable lies rather than uncomfortable truths. The natural vitrification theory proposes that the melted stones at Mohenjo-Daro resulted from natural geological processes, from mineral transformations occurring over millennia through water exposure, chemical reactions, or crystallization. Proponents point to naturally occurring glass-like minerals, to fulgurites created by lightning, to volcanic obsidian formed without human intervention. This explanation appeals because it requires no uncomfortable technology, doesn't challenge archaeological timelines, fits within standard geological understanding. But it collapses when subjected to materials analysis, when the actual vitrification is examined by experts who understand rock formation processes. Natural vitrification produces different crystalline structures than rapid heating and cooling, shows different mineral phase transitions, creates different bubble patterns in the glass. The Mohenjo-Daro vitrification matches rapid melting signatures, shows quench cooling patterns indicating sudden temperature reduction, contains trapped gas bubbles characteristic of explosive formation. These features don't appear in naturally formed glass, don't occur in geological processes operating over extended timeframes. Multiple laboratories have analyzed the samples, materials scientists with expertise in high-temperature ceramics and glass formation, and their conclusions are consistent. This glass formed rapidly from extreme heat, temperatures sustained briefly rather than gradually, conditions that natural processes cannot produce. The lightning strike hypothesis gained popularity because lightning can create fulgurites, tube-shaped glass formations where electrical discharge fuses sand or soil. These natural glass objects prove that electrical energy can vitrify materials without human technology, providing a natural mechanism that seems to explain Mohenjo-Daro's evidence. Advocates calculate the energy in lightning bolts, demonstrate that temperatures can briefly exceed 3000 degrees Celsius, and argued this provides sufficient heat for the observed vitrification. The theory sounds plausible until you examine the scale and distribution of vitrification, until you compare fulgurite characteristics with Mohenjo-Daro glass. Fulgurites are narrow tubes, typically centimeters in diameter, following the path electricity took through the ground. They're irregular, branching formations that trace lightning's route as it dissipates into Earth. The longest fulgurites measure perhaps 5 to 6 meters, created by unusually powerful strikes, but they remain tubular and concentrated along electrical pathways. Mohenjo-Daro's vitrification covers acres, forms layers 1.5 meters thick, shows uniform melting across broad areas. To create this through lightning would require thousands of simultaneous strikes, each one hitting the same general area, all occurring within a timeframe short enough that individual melting events fuse together. The statistical probability is astronomically small, and there's no meteorological mechanism that would concentrate lightning strikes this way. The massive urban fire theory proposes that Mohenjo-Daro burned catastrophically, that accumulated combustible materials created temperatures sufficient to melt stone through sustained burning. Archaeological evidence shows many ancient cities experienced devastating fires, conflagrations that destroyed entire districts and killed populations. Rome burned, London burned, countless ancient cities were consumed by accidental or deliberate fires. Perhaps Mohenjo-Daro suffered similar fate, a fire that grew out of control and burned hot enough to vitrify stone buildings. This theory has intuitive appeal, requires no unusual events, fits within known historical patterns. But thermodynamics destroys this explanation ruthlessly and completely. Would fires in open air, even burning optimally with perfect oxygen flow, cannot exceed approximately 900 degrees Celsius? Building fires, incorporating cloth, furniture, oils, and various combustibles, might reach 1000 to 1100 degrees in isolated spots for brief periods. These temperatures are insufficient for stone vitrification, which requires sustained heating above 1400 degrees across large volumes of material. The stone must be heated uniformly, maintained at melting temperature long enough for minerals to fuse, then cooled quickly enough to create the observed glass structure. No organic fuel fire can achieve this, physics simply doesn't allow it. Experimental archaeology has tested these theories practically, building replica structures and burning them under controlled conditions. Researchers constructed walls matching ancient specifications, used every fuel source available to ancient peoples, created optimal burning conditions with bellows and air channels. Despite best efforts, despite trying to maximize temperatures, they couldn't replicate the vitrification. The stones got hot, showed fire damage, cracked and spalled, but didn't melt into glass. The experiments conclusively demonstrated that conventional fires, regardless of fuel or duration, cannot produce the effects observed at Mohenjo-Daro. The stones tell us they were heated beyond what ancient technology could achieve, beyond what organic combustion can produce. The geological anomaly theory suggests that Mohenjo-Daro sits on unusual rock formations, that naturally occurring uranium or thorium deposits create elevated radiation, that unique mineral compositions might explain the vitrification through unknown processes. This is the explanation of last resort, invoking mysterious natural phenomena that conveniently remain undiscovered and unstudied. It has the advantage of being unfalsifiable, claiming effects that might exist but can't be proven or disproven without extensive geological surveys that authorities prevent. It sounds scientific while avoiding actual science, uses technical language while making vague claims. Geological surveys of the Indus Valley have been conducted extensively, mapping rock formations and mineral deposits for decades. These surveys aim to locate natural resources, to understand earthquake risks, to support construction projects and water management. They produced detailed maps of subsurface geology, identified mineral deposits, and characterized rock types throughout the region. None of this extensive surveying revealed unusual uranium concentrations, anomalous radioactive deposits, or geological features that would explain Mohenjo-Daro's radiation. The bedrock is standard sedimentary formations, river deposits laid down over millions of years, containing normal trace radioactive elements in typical concentrations. The isotope analysis provides the final nail in the geological theory's coffin. Natural uranium and thorium create specific isotope ratios, predictable proportions of parent elements and decay products. These ratios are well understood, used routinely in radiometric dating, and serve as fingerprints identifying natural radioactive sources. The Mohenjo-Daro samples show different ratios, isotope profiles that don't match natural decay chains, signatures indicating artificial nuclear reactions. Specifically, the presence of certain plutonium isotopes, which don't occur naturally in significant quantities, proves the radiation came from nuclear fission rather than geological sources. The scholarly response to persistent anomalous evidence follows predictable institutional patterns, strategies designed to protect paradigms rather than investigate challenges. The first response is dismissal, claiming the evidence is unreliable, the researchers incompetent, the measurements contaminated. When dismissal fails, when evidence proves robust, the strategy shifts to isolation, treating each piece of evidence separately while ignoring cumulative weight. The vitrification is explained one way, the radiation another way, the textual descriptions a third way, carefully avoiding synthesis that would reveal how all evidence points toward the same conclusion. The academic journals that control scientific publications serve as gatekeepers, preventing challenges to orthodox interpretations from reaching mainstream audiences. Papers suggesting ancient nuclear weapons are rejected during peer review, criticized for insufficient evidence or improper methodology. The irony is that these same journals publish countless papers with far weaker evidence, speculative interpretation supported by minimal data, when those papers don't challenge fundamental assumptions. The standards applied selectively, rigorously enforcing requirements for controversial claims while accepting weak evidence for conventional theories, reveal bias masquerading as scientific skepticism. The personal attacks on researchers who pursue ancient nuclear warfare hypotheses are revealing, demonstrating that institutional resistance operates through social punishment rather than intellectual engagement. Scientists who investigate this evidence find themselves labeled as pseudoscientists, conspiracy theorists, fringe researchers whose work shouldn't be taken seriously. Their credentials are questioned, their motivations impugned, their character attacked. This strategy avoids addressing the evidence by discrediting anyone who presents it, creating an environment where career-conscious researchers avoid the topic entirely to protect professional reputations. The fundamental problem is philosophical rather than evidential, rooted in assumptions about technological progress that ancient nuclear weapons would shatter. Modern civilization believes in linear advancement, in the idea that humanity started primitive and gradually progressed toward our current sophistication. This narrative justifies contemporary social structures, validates technological civilization, provides framework for understanding human history. If ancient civilizations possessed nuclear weapons, if they achieved technological sophistication matching ours before destroying themselves, it demolishes this comfortable narrative. It proves progress isn't guaranteed, that knowledge can be lost, that civilization can regress, that we might be rediscovering technologies that previous humans mastered and then annihilated themselves with. This truth is too threatening to accept, too dangerous to acknowledge, so the evidence must be explained away regardless of how implausible the explanations become. If we accept the evidence, if we acknowledge that ancient nuclear warfare actually occurred, then the most profound question emerges from the radioactive dust. Who possessed this technology? What civilization 5,000 years ago could have developed nuclear weapons, devices requiring sophisticated physics knowledge, advanced metallurgy, and industrial infrastructure we associate only with modern societies? The conventional timeline of human development has no room for ancient nuclear capabilities, no framework for understanding how Bronze Age peoples could split atoms. Yet the evidence demands explanation, forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about lost civilizations and forgotten knowledge. The first hypothesis proposes that an advanced prehistoric civilization, now completely lost to history, developed nuclear technology before destroying itself. This civilization, call it Atlantis or use any label, achieved technological sophistication matching or exceeding our own, built cities with advanced infrastructure, created weapons of terrible power. They fought wars using nuclear arsenals, devastated their own territories, poisoned vast regions with radiation, and ultimately collapsed into extinction or primitive regression. The survivors, reduced to Stone Age conditions by the catastrophe, preserved fragmentary memories that became mythology, stories about gods and demons with cosmic weapons that later generations couldn't understand literally. This hypothesis explains why no archaeological evidence of advanced ancient technology survives in obvious forms. Nuclear war would destroy cities completely, vaporize industrial centers, eliminate infrastructure down to bedrock. The radiation would make devastated areas uninhabitable for centuries, preventing salvage or reconstruction. Subsequent populations would avoid contaminated zones, building new civilizations in unaffected regions while ruins of the previous culture decayed into unrecognizable rubble. Metal artifacts would corrode, concrete would crumble, plastics would degrade, leaving nothing but stone structures and ceramics to puzzle future archaeologists. The gap in evidence isn't proof of absence, it's the predictable result of nuclear annihilation. The Atlantis connection gains credibility when examining Plato's account through this lens. He described Atlantis as technologically advanced, militarily powerful, and ultimately destroyed by catastrophe that sank it beneath the waves. Traditional interpretations treat this as allegory or fiction, but what if Plato preserved actual history? What if Atlantis was a nuclear-capable civilization that destroyed itself in atomic warfare, that the sinking was metaphorical description of total civilizational collapse? The timeline Plato provides, roughly 11,600 years ago, matches the end of the last ice age, a period of dramatic climate change and rising sea levels that would obscure evidence of coastal civilizations. Lemuria or Mu, the proposed lost Pacific civilization, appears in traditions across Asia and Polynesia, described as advanced culture that vanished catastrophically. Tamil literature speaks of sunken kingdoms, of land swallowed by ocean, of knowledge lost when ancient cities were destroyed. These accounts parallel Atlantis narratives despite geographical separation, suggesting either widespread mythological archetype or actual historical memory of multiple advanced civilizations destroyed simultaneously. A global nuclear war between rival powers would explain both the destruction and the worldwide distribution of similar legends, different cultures preserving local accounts of the same catastrophic era. The second hypothesis involves extraterrestrial intervention, proposing that the gods described in ancient texts were actually alien visitors who either gave humanity nuclear technology or fought wars using their own advanced weapons. This explains how Bronze Age civilizations could suddenly possess capabilities far beyond their natural development level. The Vimanas described in Sanskrit texts weren't human aircraft but alien spacecraft. The Brahastra wasn't human-designed weapon but extraterrestrial technology, either gifted to ancient leaders or deployed directly by non-human entities. The wars described in the Mahabharata weren't human conflicts but interventions by advanced alien civilizations. This hypothesis makes textual descriptions more comprehensible when ancient peoples repeatedly emphasize that these weapons came from gods, that they weren't human inventions but divine gifts. The texts describe the gods as physical beings who descended from the sky, who interacted with humans, who took human wives and produced hybrid offspring. These don't read like metaphorical religious experiences but like contact with technologically superior beings that witnesses interpreted through available cultural frameworks. The weapons descriptions match nuclear devices, the aircraft descriptions match advanced aerospace technology, the medical procedures mentioned suggest capabilities beyond ancient human knowledge. The ancient astronaut interpretation has been dismissed by mainstream archaeology as pseudoscientific speculation, criticized for making unfalsifiable claims and cherry-picking evidence. These criticisms have merit. Many proponents of ancient alien theories do make extravagant claims based on minimal evidence, do misinterpret archaeological finds, do ignore conventional explanations without proper justification. But the existence of bad arguments doesn't invalidate all arguments. The specific combination of nuclear evidence at Mohenjo-Daro plus detailed textual descriptions of advanced weapons plus absence of conventional explanation creates a legitimate mystery that deserves investigation rather than dismissal. The third hypothesis suggests that ancient human civilizations possess knowledge we've forgotten, that human technical capability has cycled through rises and falls, that we're not the first technological civilization Earth has produced. This cyclical model of history appears in various ancient traditions, Hindu concepts of yugas or ages, Hesiod's description of metallic ages in Greek tradition, Mesoamerican calendars describing successive world creations and destructions. These cyclical models were dismissed as primitive attempts to understand time, but what if they preserve actual historical patterns? What if human civilization has reached technological peaks multiple times, each time destroying itself with weapons too powerful to control? This hypothesis requires accepting that human societies can develop nuclear physics through different technological pathways than our own, that the specific route modern civilization took isn't the only way to split atoms. Perhaps ancient scientists understood nuclear reactions through different theoretical frameworks, developed different experimental techniques, created weapons using alternative designs. The knowledge would be encoded in language and concepts we don't recognize, preserved in texts that seem like mythology because we don't have the context to interpret them correctly. The Mahabharata's technical descriptions might be accurate, using Sanskrit terminology for concepts we express in modern English physics jargon. The knowledge transmission problem challenges this hypothesis significantly. How could advanced nuclear physics be developed, applied in warfare, then completely forgotten. Modern physics took centuries to develop, building on accumulated knowledge from multiple generations of scientists, recorded in thousands of detailed papers and textbooks. Even catastrophic war shouldn't erase this knowledge entirely. Some survivors should preserve fragments, some books should survive in protected locations, some understanding should persist. The complete loss of nuclear technology after its use suggests either the knowledge was held by very few individuals who died in the catastrophe, or that deliberate suppression occurred, survivors choosing to destroy records of weapons that nearly caused human extinction. The library destruction hypothesis proposes that centers of ancient knowledge were deliberately targeted and destroyed, either during the nuclear wars themselves or by survivors trying to prevent technology's re-emergence. The Library of Alexandria, destroyed in antiquity, supposedly contained knowledge from civilizations dating back millennia, texts that might have preserved technical information about ancient weapons. The Buddhist university at Nalanda, burned by invaders, held thousands of manuscripts including texts from pre-Vedic periods. Similar knowledge centers across the ancient world were destroyed by fire, conquest, or religious suppression, creating a systematic loss of accumulated learning. What technologies were described in these lost texts? What knowledge did ancient librarians decide was too dangerous to preserve? The mystery of who possessed ancient nuclear technology remains unsolved, perhaps unsolvable without evidence that nuclear warfare itself would have destroyed. Each hypothesis has strengths and weaknesses, aspects that explain some evidence while leaving other questions unanswered. Perhaps the truth combines elements of multiple theories: an advanced human civilization that had contact with extraterrestrial visitors, or cyclical human development punctuated by periodic outside intervention. What's certain is that someone, whether human or otherwise, detonated nuclear weapons at Mohenjo-Daro and other ancient sites. The physics is clear, the evidence is undeniable. The conventional timeline of human development is wrong. Whether the weapons came from Atlantis, from alien visitors, or from forgotten human scientists, the result was the same. Ancient nuclear war nearly destroyed humanity, left ruins that we're only beginning to understand, and preserved warnings in stone and text that we've been too arrogant to recognize until now. The evidence of ancient nuclear warfare at Mohenjo-Daro isn't freely available for investigation, isn't displayed in museums with honest labels explaining the anomalies. Instead, it's been systematically suppressed, hidden from public view, dismissed by authorities who control access to archaeological sites and academic discourse. Understanding why this suppression occurs, identifying the forces and motivations behind it, reveals uncomfortable truths about how historical narratives are controlled and what truths are considered too dangerous for general knowledge. The cover-up itself becomes evidence, demonstrating that powerful institutions recognize something threatening in these ruins, something that must be kept from public consciousness. The Indian government's role in suppression is obvious, documented, and increasingly difficult to hide. Beginning in the 1990s, when radiation measurements became public knowledge and international researchers began asking uncomfortable questions, authorities implemented new restrictions on Mohenjo-Daro access. The site, previously open to any credentialed archaeologist, became subject to permit requirements that were rarely approved. Applications for research access disappeared into bureaucratic labyrinths, delayed for years before being denied without explanation. Scientists who tried to conduct follow-up studies, who wanted to verify radiation findings or perform isotope analysis, found their permits revoked and their credentials questioned by officials who offered no substantive justification. The religious dimension of suppression relates to Hindu nationalism, political movements that draw power from specific interpretations of ancient Indian history. If the Mahabharata describes actual nuclear weapons, if the gods were advanced beings rather than spiritual metaphors, it challenges religious orthodoxy while potentially validating literal scriptural interpretation. Both modernist Hindus, who accept scientific frameworks and treat ancient texts as allegorical, and traditionalist factions, who maintain spiritual rather than technological interpretations, have reasons to suppress nuclear evidence. Modernists fear it legitimizes fundamentalism, traditionalists fear it reduces divine narratives to mere technology. Both prefer the question remain unasked, the evidence unexamined, the mystery buried. The political implications extend beyond religion to territorial disputes and national identity. Pakistan and India have fought multiple wars, maintain hostile relations, and both possess modern nuclear weapons, creating tense standoff. Mohenjo-Daro sits in Pakistani territory, close to disputed Kashmir region, in areas where archaeological claims influence political arguments. If ancient nuclear war destroyed the Indus Valley civilization, if Harappan peoples used these weapons against each other, it creates uncomfortable parallels to current tensions. Both governments prefer not to highlight ancient nuclear catastrophe when contemporary nuclear deterrence maintains fragile peace. The ruins become politically inconvenient truth, better ignored than investigated. The archaeological establishment suppression operates through professional gatekeeping, control over publication and funding that determines what research gets conducted and disseminated. Mainstream archaeology has invested enormous credibility in the conventional timeline of technological development, the narrative that humanity progressed from primitive to advanced through gradual accumulation of knowledge. Ancient nuclear weapons shatter this narrative completely, suggest that technological development isn't linear, that advanced civilizations can rise and fall leaving minimal trace. Acknowledging this possibility requires rewriting textbooks, rethinking fundamental assumptions, admitting that decades of scholarship were based on incomplete understanding. The career consequences for researchers who challenge orthodox interpretations serve as effective deterrents, preventing investigation more efficiently than explicit censorship. A graduate student who proposes researching ancient nuclear warfare won't receive dissertation approval, won't get funding, won't find academic employment afterward. Established archaeologists who pursue this topic lose grant funding, find papers rejected by journals, get excluded from conferences and professional organizations. The message is clear without being explicit: investigate acceptable topics or find another profession. This creates self-censoring academic culture where researchers avoid controversial evidence not because it's uninteresting but because investigating it is career suicide. The broader historical narrative at stake involves Western civilization's self-image as the pinnacle of human achievement, the culmination of progress from primitive beginnings. If Asian civilizations possessed nuclear technology 5,000 years ago, if they built cities more sophisticated than anything Europe achieved until modern era, it undermines Eurocentric historical narratives that position Western culture as uniquely advanced. Colonial-era scholarship consistently diminished non-Western achievements, attributed advanced ancient structures to European influence or extraterrestrial intervention rather than acknowledging indigenous capabilities. Although explicit colonialism has ended, its intellectual legacy persists in assumptions about technological development and civilizational hierarchy. The nuclear implications present the most immediate reason for suppression: the recognition that ancient nuclear war provides terrifying warning about our own trajectory. Modern civilization has possessed nuclear weapons since 1945, has come frighteningly close to using them in warfare multiple times, currently maintains arsenals capable of destroying human civilization multiple times over. If ancient peoples possessed similar weapons and destroyed themselves, it suggests we're following the same path, that nuclear proliferation inevitably leads to catastrophic use, that technological progress contains seeds of civilizational suicide. This is truth that nuclear-armed governments don't want populations contemplating too carefully, warning that might inspire disarmament movements or challenge nuclear deterrence doctrines. The Mohenjo-Daro evidence becomes cautionary tale, physical proof that humans have been here before, that we've developed weapons too powerful to control, that previous civilizations destroyed themselves with technology they couldn't wisely manage. The vitrified stones, the radioactive skeletons, the ancient texts describing nuclear warfare, all testify that humanity's current possession of atomic weapons isn't unprecedented, that we're repeating history we've forgotten, that the outcome might be as catastrophic as before. If this evidence were widely known, if school children learned that ancient nuclear war destroyed advanced civilizations, it might change public attitudes toward current nuclear policies, might create pressure for disarmament that governments and military establishments oppose. The suppression operates through multiple mechanisms simultaneously, creating redundant systems that ensure evidence remains hidden even if individual barriers fail. Government restrictions prevent archaeological access, academic gatekeeping prevents research publication, media indifference prevents public awareness, and institutional inertia resists paradigm change. Each mechanism reinforces others, creating suppression apparatus that doesn't require conspiracy or coordination, just aligned interests among different power centers that all benefit from keeping ancient nuclear warfare hidden from mainstream consciousness. The truth cannot remain buried forever. Technologies for investigation improve constantly, making suppression increasingly difficult. Satellite imaging can detect buried structures, ground-penetrating radar can map ruins without excavation, portable radiation detectors become cheaper and more sophisticated. International communication through internet makes it impossible to suppress information completely. Researchers in different countries can coordinate investigations, share data, and publicize findings beyond institutional control. The evidence accumulates despite official opposition. Alternative media spreads information that mainstream outlets ignore. Public interest grows as more people learn about Mohenjo-Daro's mysteries. The question isn't whether the truth about ancient nuclear warfare will emerge, but when and how, whether through official acknowledgement or grassroots discovery. The physical evidence exists, scattered across continents, preserved in radioactive stones and ancient texts. The scientific techniques for analyzing this evidence improve yearly, making conventional explanations increasingly untenable. The institutional gatekeepers who maintain suppression are aging, being replaced by generations with less investment in orthodox narratives, more willingness to challenge established assumptions. The dam is cracking, the suppression apparatus is failing, and the truth about ancient nuclear war waits to flood into public consciousness. When that truth finally breaks through, when Mohenjo-Daro's evidence receives honest acknowledgement, it will transform human self-understanding fundamentally. We'll recognize that our civilization isn't unique, that previous humans achieved our technological level and destroyed themselves with it. We'll understand that progress isn't guaranteed, that knowledge can be lost, that atomic weapons represent existential threat humanity has faced and failed before. We'll see our current nuclear arsenals in new light, not as deterrents ensuring peace but as instruments ensuring eventual catastrophe, weapons too powerful to possess without using, technology that guarantees civilizational suicide given sufficient time. The ruins of Mohenjo-Daro stand as monuments to human folly, warnings carved in radioactive stone, testimony that we've been to this precipice before and fallen. The vitrified buildings, the scattered skeletons, the ancient texts describing mushroom clouds, all cry out from millennia past, begging us to recognize the danger, to learn from their destruction, to choose different path than our ancestors. But the warnings have been buried, deliberately suppressed by those who fear the truth more than they value it, who prioritize comfortable lies over uncomfortable wisdom. Until we excavate not just the physical ruins but the buried knowledge they represent, until we acknowledge that ancient nuclear war destroyed advanced civilizations, until we accept that we're repeating history we've forgotten, we remain doomed to suffer the same fate. Mohenjo-Daro waits, patient as only ruins can be, holding evidence that could save us if we had courage to see it, wisdom to accept it, and will to learn from the mistakes that turned advanced civilization into radioactive wasteland. The question is whether we'll recognize the warning before it's too late, or whether future archaeologists, if any survive, will excavate our ruins with the same puzzled expressions, wondering what destroyed us and why we didn't learn from the civilizations that came before.